For months, Ukraine has been executing a campaign against occupied Crimea, with a clarity of purpose that has become increasingly visible in the results. Medium-range drones striking logistics convoys on every road feeding the peninsula. Long-range systems reaching deep into Crimea itself to degrade the defensive infrastructure Russia has spent years building. The R-280 highway, Russia's primary land artery from the mainland through occupied southern Ukraine, has seen military traffic fall by 71% under sustained drone pressure. Bridges have been struck repeatedly. Pontoon crossings built to replace damaged bridges have been struck too. Oil terminals on both coasts of the Kerch Strait burned in a single coordinated night. 3 ferries serving as logistics backup were put out of commission simultaneously. Crimea is being isolated, cut off from the supply lines that make it militarily functional, left stranded in a war where it was supposed to be the strategic centerpiece that justified everything Russia had done since 2014. And now, Russia is doing something that tells you more about Ukraine's intentions than any Ukrainian public statement has. It is fortifying its beaches. On June 17th, Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Dmytro Pletenchuk made comments that deserve careful attention, not for what Ukraine is claiming about its own plans, but for what he revealed about Russian behavior. Russia has begun reinforcing its defensive positions along Crimea's coastlines, not token improvements. Active fortification of what Russian military planners assess as the peninsula's most vulnerable landing zones. The enemy considers this an absolutely real threat, Pletenchuk said in an interview with the Kiev Independent. The Russians are actively strengthening areas in Crimea vulnerable to landings because they believe in such a possibility. When an occupying military force begins hardening its beaches, it is telling you what it fears. Russia would not be diverting resources to coastal fortification if its assessment was that a landing was implausible. Military resources are finite. The decision to reinforce coastal defenses means someone in the Russian command structure has concluded that the probability of an amphibious operation against Crimea is high enough to justify the expenditure. That conclusion did not emerge from nowhere. Pletenchuk noted that Ukraine's Navy has been conducting training consistent with amphibious operations. Special operations conducted along and near Crimea's coastline have fed into the Russian perception, and the sustained drone campaign against Crimea's logistics network carries a dual reading. It isolates the peninsula in the immediate term and simultaneously removes the defensive depth that would make a landing prohibitively costly. The fear in Russian command is real. The question is whether that fear reflects an imminent operation, a deliberate deception, or a rational assessment of the strategic trajectory Ukraine is on. Subscribe now if this level of strategic analysis on Ukraine's Crimea campaign is what you want from this channel. The operational and strategic picture here is moving faster than most reporting captures. Ukraine's Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov has stated that the isolation campaign is going exactly according to plan, and that it will turn Crimea into an island that could lead to very unexpected consequences for the Russians. He chose not to specify what those consequences would be. The vagueness is not accidental. Ukraine has every strategic incentive to keep Russia uncertain about whether the isolation campaign is a prelude to a landing or a standalone attrition strategy. Uncertainty forces Russia to prepare for both simultaneously, dividing its defensive resources and attention. What is concrete is the scale of what Ukraine has built to execute this campaign. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense contracted 300% more medium-range drones in the first 4 months of 2026 than it did across all of 2025. President Zelensky has claimed the increase is closer to 500%. Whatever the precise figure, May and June have demonstrated what this expansion of capability produces in practice. A highway turned into a hazard for Russian logistics. 50 supply trucks and fuel tankers destroyed in a single operation at Armyansk. Bridges struck repeatedly across the northern Crimea approaches. Pontoon alternatives rendered as vulnerable as the bridges they replaced. Ukraine is now producing approximately 5,000 medium and long-range drones per month, with projections suggesting annual production approaching 7 million units by year's end. That production capacity fundamentally changes what an amphibious operation could look like in 2026 compared to what one would have required in 1944. In August 2023, Ukraine's military intelligence executed what was described as a special operation on the Crimean coast near the settlements of Mayak and Olenivka. A small contingent of Ukrainian forces landed using waterborne vessels, engaged Russian military personnel, inflicted approximately 30 casualties, damaged 4 Russian high-speed boats, and withdrew. That operation was significant at the time because it demonstrated something that had not previously been confirmed in this war. Ukraine is capable of landing soldiers on Crimea, conducting combat operations, and extracting them. At the scale it was executed, it was a proof of concept rather than an operational campaign. But proof of concepts have a way of becoming blueprints. The question is, what scaling that concept would require, and what it would face. Pletenchuk himself invoked the D-Day landings at Normandy as a reference point, specifically mentioning Omaha Beach as an example of the defensive conditions Ukraine would encounter. Mines in the water and across landing zones, barbed wire, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles designed to slow advancing troops, machine gun positions and fortified bunkers with overlapping fields of fire, and an attacker approaching from the sea who would have limited air defense coverage, leaving Russian aviation free to operate against the landing force. The historical numbers are instructive even if the comparison is imperfect. Approximately 160,000 Allied troops participated in the D-Day landings across all 5 beaches. The operation involved 7,000 naval vessels, including roughly 4,000 landing craft, supported by 12,000 aircraft. The total Allied casualties exceeded 10,000 on that single day, with approximately 2,400 on Omaha Beach alone. Ukraine does not have a conventional navy capable of mounting an operation at that scale. Global Firepower's military index places Ukraine's naval inventory at approximately 169 vessels, the majority being patrol craft rather than landing ships. Ukraine's aerial assets number around 347 platforms, not 12,000 aircraft providing close air support over landing beaches. If a Crimea landing had to look like Normandy, Ukraine could not execute it. But a Crimea landing in 2026 would not look like Normandy. And that distinction matters enormously. The fundamental change between 1944 and 2026 is the role of unmanned systems in every phase of an amphibious operation. The air support that 12,000 aircraft provided over the Normandy beaches, suppressing German gun emplacements, attacking reinforcement routes, destroying radar installations, can be provided in 2026 by drones. Not a few drones, waves of them. Medium-range strike systems hitting fortified positions along the coast days and weeks before any landing craft approaches. FPV drones targeting individual gun positions and observation posts. Kamikaze maritime drones attacking Russian naval vessels attempting to intercept a landing fleet before it reaches the beach. Loitering munitions waiting over defensive positions for any movement that indicates reinforcement. Ukraine has demonstrated the effectiveness of maritime drones against the Black Sea Fleet specifically, driving the fleet from its primary base at Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, a significantly worse operational position. Systems including the Sea Baby and Magura 5 have struck Russian warships in harbor. The Toloka underwater drone is designed for operations that include mine detection and neutralization, potentially the capability required to open lanes through the minefields Pletenchuk mentioned as a primary obstacle to any landing. The Sea Trident drone, reported by RBC Ukraine, carries a 1,000-kilogram warhead capable of sinking large warships or destroying coastal infrastructure. At scale, these systems can do what the Allied naval gunfire and aerial bombardment accomplished before the Normandy landings: suppress the defenses that would otherwise make a beach assault catastrophically costly. None of this eliminates the fundamental requirement that Pletenchuk himself stated clearly: you cannot liberate a peninsula without getting soldiers to it and keeping them there. Drones can suppress defenses, they cannot hold ground. Human forces are necessary for any operation that aims at lasting control rather than temporary disruption. The operational geometry of Crimea creates both opportunities and severe constraints for any landing scenario. The peninsula has approximately 750 kilometers of coastline, a large perimeter that Russia cannot fortify with equal density at every point. That length creates multiple potential landing zones and forces Russia to distribute its coastal defense forces rather than concentrate them. Ukraine's isolation campaign compounds this problem for Russia. A garrison that is receiving limited resupply cannot maintain the same defensive density across a long perimeter as one that is fully supplied. But Ukraine's options for getting forces onto and across that coastline are constrained by the naval assets available. Landing craft capable of putting significant numbers of troops on a defended beach are not assets Ukraine possesses in large numbers. The small patrol vessel fleet and the maritime drone force can support an operation but cannot substitute for dedicated amphibious assault shipping at any significant scale. The land approach into Crimea runs through the Perekop Isthmus, a strip of land approximately 8 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Any ground force attempting to cross Perekop faces the defender's advantage in an extreme form. The terrain channels the attacker into a narrow front where numerical superiority cannot be effectively applied, and where a small defending force in prepared positions can impose severe costs on a much larger attacking formation. A combined approach, amphibious landing at coastal points while ground forces press at Perekop simultaneously, would divide Russian defensive attention and resources. It would also require Ukraine to sustain 2 simultaneous high-intensity operations at a moment when other front sectors, particularly in Donetsk, remain active. The resources committed to a Crimea operation cannot simultaneously be elsewhere. A realistic assessment has to acknowledge that any operation aimed at physically taking and holding Crimea would cost Ukraine significant casualties. Thousands, possibly substantially more, depending on the residual strength of Russian defenses at the time of the operation. That cost has to be weighed against the strategic value of control versus the alternative of sustained isolation. There is a second strategic logic available to Ukraine that does not require an amphibious assault to succeed. Pletenchuk himself noted that Ukraine has deliberately chosen not to destroy the Kerch Bridge, the structure that Putin personally inaugurated, that connects Crimea to Russia, that carries the symbolic and logistical weight of the annexation. Ukraine has struck its air defenses, struck the fuel infrastructure on both sides of the strait, struck the ferries alongside it. It has not destroyed the bridge deck. The reason, in my assessment, is strategic. A bridge that remains standing gives Russian forces an exit route. A military that has a way out is more likely to use it than to fight to the last position. Destroying the bridge converts the occupation garrison from a force with an escape option into a force with no choice but to hold. That is not the outcome Ukraine wants. Ukraine wants the garrison to leave. The isolation strategy, taken to its endpoint without a landing, produces a garrison that cannot be supplied, cannot be reinforced, and whose morale degrades under fuel rationing, food shortages, and the daily psychological pressure of knowing that the defensive network around them has been systematically degraded by an opponent they cannot effectively counter. At some threshold, that combination produces a withdrawal. The Kinburn Spit, the narrow strip of land in Mykolaiv Oblast that extends into the Black Sea west of Crimea, adds another dimension. Russian forces used it to launch drone operations against Ukrainian targets. Ukrainian forces have been applying pressure there. Regaining control of the Kinburn Spit would position Ukraine to extend drone coverage across Crimea's western approaches, further compressing the defensive space available to Russian forces on the peninsula. The conclusion Pletenchuk's framing points toward is that Ukraine's optimal strategy may not be a D-Day landing. It may be making a D-Day landing unnecessary, isolating Crimea so completely, degrading its defensive and logistical infrastructure so thoroughly, and preserving the exit route so deliberately that the Russian garrison reaches a point where withdrawal is the only rational option available. A landing in that scenario would not look like Omaha Beach. It would look like Ukrainian forces arriving to secure a peninsula that has already been abandoned. Russia is responding to the landing threat as if it is real and imminent. It would not be hardening its beaches if it did not believe in the possibility. That belief is itself a strategic asset for Ukraine. It keeps Russian resources committed to coastal defense that might otherwise be deployed to the active front in Donetsk or Zaporizhia. Whether Ukraine intends a landing or intends to force a withdrawal through isolation, the Russian response to the threat serves Ukrainian interests. Preparing for a landing that may not come is almost as valuable as the landing itself. If the preparation diverts Russian defensive resources, and attention at the moment they are most needed elsewhere. What is clear from every piece of available evidence? The confirmed training, the 2023 Special Operation precedent, the drone production numbers, the infrastructure strikes, the Pletenchuk comments, and the Russian fortification activity, is that Ukraine has constructed the conditions under which a landing becomes feasible in a way it was not 2 years ago, and that Russia believes those conditions have been constructed. Whether Ukraine chooses to use those conditions for an assault or for continued attrition may be the most consequential decision of the next phase of this war. The answer is not yet public, but the groundwork that would support either choice has been built. Stay with this channel. The Crimea campaign is the most strategically significant development in this conflict since the Black Sea Fleet was driven from Sevastopol, and every week that passes changes the operational picture in ways worth tracking carefully.